Well, first, maybe you might want to explain a little bit about our reason for being here, which is Abd el Kader, Emir Abd el Kader, who's a remarkable individual that many people don't know very much about.
I'd be happy to. What I'll do is take a page out of Al Gray's book. He was a former commandant of the Marine Corps, and he used to always interrupt briefings by, he was an impatient guy, had a lot of things to do, and he'd say, just give me the conclusions, and then I'll decide whether I want to wait and listen to the rest. So I will start off by telling you why I think he's important today, what his relevance is, and then tell you a few things about the source of his fame, which was actually extraordinary, because for 50 years he strode really the stage of the world. Perhaps the best way to describe his relevance is to read to you what a Pakistani scholar by the name of Muhammad Khan Nasser, who's the monthly editor of Al-Sharia journal, a journal that's widely read and respected by Islamic scholars. He says, Abd el Kader is not only a symbol of the Muslim concept of resistance and struggle against foreign domination, but also an embodiment of true theological, moral, and rational ideas taught by Islam. First, he is not overwhelmed by a blind zeal to fight at all costs. Rather, he is capable of weighing pros and cons and making wise judgments. Secondly, he is strictly guided in his decisions and his general attitude by the legal limitations and moral obligations set forth in the divine law. Thus he knows when to put the infidels to death and when to put his own life at risk to save them. Thirdly, his political animosity with the French does not make him blind to what is common between his own religion and theirs. Finally, he can put himself in his adversary's shoes, look into the complexities of the situation, and understand the different factors that compel them to follow a certain course. All these aspects have been evidently shown in the book, and I strongly recommend that it be published in English and translated into Arabic, Persian, and Urdu as well. It is, as we speak, being translated into Urdu, but what this last quality reminds me of particularly is being able to put himself in his adversary's shoes. Remarkable. Abd el Kader was in many ways a fundamentalist. He was a Sharia-loving, puritanical, not in a Taliban sense, which is a sort of deformation, but he was one who basically followed the rules. You don't drink and you don't gamble, and you dress modestly and you expect your women to, and yet he was also very curious about the rest of the world, and he had a kind of big tent Vatican II type of Islam, because he believed that God is greater. God is greater than whatever we think God can be, and none of us, no finite creature, can grasp the infinite. He studied Greek philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, Arab classics, Ibn Khaldun. He was trained in veterinary medicine, pharmacology. He was exposed to mathematics, astronomy, and he had a poetic side to him. You could divide his struggle into maybe three components of his life, or four even. The struggle to become well educated, which I think he succeeded quite well at. The struggle to lead a jihad, for which he had no education or preparation to do. So he struggled with French occupation for 15 years. It involved both military struggle as well as diplomatic struggle and psychological struggle, struggling against an overwhelmingly powerful enemy in terms of his technology, firepower. And then he had 5 years of struggle with despair and betrayal in French prisons, when an agreement that he made with French generals was nullified by a successive government. in 1847. And then he had the struggle of living in exile, living in a foreign country. Even though they were Muslim countries, they were still not his home. He never allowed the demons of hatred and anger and the desire for revenge to control him. Jihad means holy exertion, to try to live a righteous life in war and peace, day by day. And to live a true jihad, you're always fighting to make compassion and mercy dominant over violence and hatred. In the first phase, his fame grew because he was this extraordinary military leader who had a natural aptitude, and he frustrated some of Napoleon's best generals for 15 years. So Timothy Davis, a lawyer from Utica, names a town in Iowa, which is still there today, El Kader, a village. And his partner said to him, well, what do we name this place? And they turned to him and he said, well, there's this Arab chieftain I've been reading about, and he admired from what he'd read about him. Let's name it after him. What did he admire about him? Well, he related to him because in 1846, he was only 2 generations from our own struggle against British colonialism. We've sort of forgotten the times when we were subject to colonial powers. Why we can't today relate very well to it, because it's so distant in our past, and most of us don't even know our past anyway. But here, it was still a fresh memory what Americans had gone through, and he related to this Arab David fighting the French Goliath. And in addition to that, Emir Abd el Kader had established a reputation of being a man of his word, a sort of a chivalrous fighter who treated his prisoners with remarkable concern, and later on in life, when he was in prison, his greatest fans and lobbyists and promoters were French soldiers who had been his prisoners. The people of Bordeaux were so impressed by his character and his graciousness and his manners that in the presidential election of 1849, the French presidential election of 1849, citizens of Bordeaux wrote him in as a write-in candidate for the presidency of France. And it was in Damascus that perhaps he reached his greatest level of world fame and recognition, and that occurred in the years following the Crimean War, 1854, 1855. The Druze went a little bit too far, and they started basically murdering the Christians in the Christian quarter. And Abd el Kader, seeing evil and knowing you're supposed to combat evil when you see it, went in with his men and started rescuing Christians, as well as the diplomatic community that included British, American, French, Russian, and turned his home, or his residence, which had formerly been a residence of Ibn Arabi, into essentially a refuge for the Christian and European diplomatic community. And when he had angry Druze and the rioters pounding on his door saying, give us the Christians, give us the Christians, you killed Christians, why are you harboring the Christians? Well, he came back with a very logical answer. He said, the Christians I killed attacked my country. These Christians have done nothing. They are innocents. They are victims of lawlessness. You want to fight about it? I'm ready to fight. Well, the rioters disappeared pretty fast. As a result of that, he was hailed as a sort of great savior of the Christians. He wasn't the only Muslim to protect Christians, but he saved the most. President Lincoln, Queen Victoria, Pope Pius, Emir Shamil, the Turkish Sultan, people from all walks of life, French Masons, send him letters of congratulations. New York Times writes an article about him. So he was a man of the hour. He cultivated virtue. And he cultivated it because of the way he had been instructed by his parents. His father catechized him in the 4 virtues. And interestingly, the 4 virtues are the same virtues as Christian monks catechized. Intellect, the ability to make distinctions, have good judgment, good memory, finesse in judgment, common sense, a whole set of intellectual qualities that help you make good decisions. Moral courage, the courage to direct or restrain your anger in the right way. Equity, fairness, treating people fairly. And finally, self-control. You can't treat people fairly and equitably if you can't control yourself. If you're envious, prideful, angry, how do you treat people fairly? He took it seriously enough that when he was fighting the French, he insisted that his troops not mistreat French prisoners, even though it was long-standing, centuries-long custom to decapitate prisoners as you take on the battlefield. For the simple reason that you didn't want to feed and water prisoners in the desert. That's kind of ridiculous. And secondly, your share of the loot when you get back to camp is based on how many heads are hanging from your saddle. So you impose an impractical obligation on your men, and you rob them of their remuneration when you tell them they can't chop off the heads of prisoners. Very unpopular, but he enforced it by a combination of carrots and sticks. He rewarded his men financially, and he punished them physically if they were ever reported as mistreating prisoners. So as a result, the French had a real problem on their hand. They couldn't let the word out that Abd el Kader was this great humanitarian. They were fighting a fanatic. They were fighting a nut, a brute, a savage. So what is a fanatic? What's the difference between a fanatic and a freedom fighter? To Timothy Davis, he was a freedom fighter. Fanatic is basically somebody who's fighting on behalf of a cause we don't understand or don't believe in. In this case, he was fighting on the behalf of his faith. Christians didn't fight on their faith anymore at that point. If you fight and believe, you're willing to die for your faith in our modern times, you're generally considered a fanatic, whether you're living your faith well-guided or rightly guided or wrongly guided. But the French, they relate to the flag. If you relate to your flag and you're fanatical on behalf of your country, you're a patriot. But if you're fanatical on behalf of your religion, you're a fanatic. And I think that mentality pretty much carries through today.